So, good evening. I come to my second lecture. And I'd like to draw your attention to the psychoanalytic diagnostic procedure with concentrating the emphasis on dyslexic children. For this, I will go on from the past lecture to focusing on the early areas of the affective system. At first, what is to do diagnostically? As usual, we have to raise questions upon the personality of the child and his developmental history. One has to ask how he feels and how he thinks about his problems, or what are perhaps his dreams, and what are his preferred games, and who are his friends. The diagnostic interviews with the child are often like the overture of the opera following in the psychoanalytic process. For my therapeutic work, the diagnostic interviews were always very important, more important than any tests, even projective tests. But there is no one case like another. One has to offer some choice to the child. One has to avoid putting any pressure on the child. There are children who like to draw or to play, but all this is also dependent on the age of the child. And dyslexic children are school children. That is to say, most of the ones I have treated were 10, 11 or 12 years old when they came. The youngest was 9-year-old. So all of them preferred to speak with me, and there were some who liked additionally to draw or to play. And all of these children had already had many tests with psychologists elsewhere. So that really was enough for them, and they mostly disliked doing tests. In addition to the investigations of the child, the interviews with the parents are absolutely necessary. How do they see the problems of their child? How do they see the whole personality of their child? Sometimes parents remember fantasies about their child they had during pregnancy. What can parents remember of the development of the child, of their early interactions with the child? What can parents report about the interactions of the child with other members of the family, sisters and brothers, grandparents, and so on? We like also to know how parents interact with the child in certain situations in the present. Do they see any differences with their interactions in the past? We also try to get an impression of the personality of the parents, their past, their childhood and relationships with their parents and own sisters and brothers. What counts is not to know everything about the parents and to receive all-including responses to our questions, but to notice and to feel preferences and resistances, latent sufferings and open conflicts. Our first impressions of the patient, the evaluation of how he mastered his different developmental stages, the evaluation of his anxieties, his conflicts and defenses, the way he evaluates himself and others, the way he manages his feelings, all this and more are somewhat like a first step for the beginning of a therapeutic process, which at the same time continues as a deeper, ongoing and refining diagnostic process. Ideally, one makes a diagnostic profile for the best evaluation of the different developmental areas of a child, and after the treatment, one makes a so-called terminal diagnostic profile to compare and to evaluate what has changed for the better through treatment. The diagnostic profile was published in 1962 by Anna Freud and her co-workers. The profile is really a milestone of the Hampstead School for Child Psychoanalysis. In the course of time, the profile has been modified. During the last 2 decades, Peter Fonagy et al. Added new categories of ego functions to apply to more complex psychic processes of mental life. The use of the profile is an excellent method for research of single cases. So I did 3 case studies in my book on dyslexia, together with cases in a shorter version as well. The book was published in 2002. In these lectures I refer to my book without presenting profiles, but I will summarize the most important results. New in my research of dyslexia is to examine the very early stages of affective relationships and of the spoken language, inclusive the processes of symbolization and mentalization. I will show the dynamic unfolding for comprehending later developmental stages and the outcome of dyslexia. What I found to be essential in the developmental history of the child was later confirmed in the transference situations of the therapeutic process. What happens in the so-called transference situation is the following. The patient tries to re-establish the relationships he is used to be, and then he repeats certain experiences of his past. It is important, therefore, to pay attention to the use of the spoken language and the speech of actions and body language, not only in play, but also in self-destructive, punishing actions. Important to have in our mind is also to evaluate any early traumatization, where we can assume traumatized experiences in the early processes of symbolization and speech development that will affect further development and have influence on the future kind of defenses, and as we will see on the following case, also on dyslexia. The clinical material illustrates what I have found to be at the center of the developmental distortion of some dyslexic children, similar to the case of Jimmy. That's the case I will speak about. I found cumulative early traumatic experiences caused by mothers' at least partial neglect of early verbal emotional exchange, just in the period of transition from the pre-verbal to the verbal period, plus the lack of the father being emotionally present. There are different reasons possible. In the present case, it was the emotional withdrawal of father coupled with an attitude of criticism and harshness towards the boy when the boy began to speak, and finally the pointed rivalry of the older brother. What I found in other cases was similar and different at the same time. The factors responsible for the whole personality disorder and the severity in the later development of dyslexia had not always the same intensity, and the reasons and attitudes from the parents were sometimes different. But to these differences I shall come back later. Let us begin with the worst conditions. Of great significance were usually the areas of the early affective system, as I told, of communication between caregiver and infant, be it already in the pre-verbal period or more during the verbal period. I have seen children who seem to have never had sufficient vocal feedback, a mirror of sounds, leading to the formation of speech-sounds dialogue. They had even lacked the feeling for reciprocity and for experience of rhythms in time. These children had begun often to speak relatively late and often in a disturbed way. These children did not use the word no in relation to their parents. They showed their opposite feelings by means of body movements. Here we have some important hints that reveal that something must have been lacking in the earlier relationships and consequently also in some important developmental stages of the child. When we speak of emotional exchange with a child, we have always to be aware that speech has a central role in this effective communication. That is to say, the nonverbal and the verbal system are equally important in the effective communication. Why is this so important? It sounds so self-evident, so obvious that we learn to speak, but we are not always aware of the processes of development which get started in the how we learn to speak. And there are several processes arising from the vocal ground, as we will see. The French psychoanalyst Didier Anzieux talks in 1991 about the parent's sounds addressed to the baby as a sounding envelope in English. To understand this metaphor, we have to imagine a tender voice speaking friendly words. The parent's words, following Anzieux, must be addressed to the baby, to the little child, and at the same time the parents must communicate something from themselves, so that it sounds as a very personal and intimate feedback. So, over time, the little dialogues with the child are responsible for the feeling of being with, of reciprocity, and for sharing affects. Thereby, the child also has experiences of rhythms. Through the parents' verbal and affective interactions, the child learns to give names not only to persons and things, but also to feeling states. This prepares the very important ground for the processes of symbolization and mentalization. All processes are related to each other and develop at the same time. As I already pointed out last lecture, the process of symbolization starts in the course of multiple affective interactions between child and the caregiver. We have to think this as a continuing process, where signals are given and affects become regulated in co-regulated problem solving. Following Greenspan and Schenker, two things have to occur for creating a meaningful symbol. The first one is that the child separates a perception from automatic action. For example, the hungry little child does not need to cry in a desperate manner. He can stop crying because he holds onto the image of a nurturing mother while waiting for her when he hears her voice coming nearer. The second thing lies in the fact that he has invested emotions in the multi-sensory images of mother. Now the word mother is more than a name for someone, but the name mother has become a meaningful symbol. In this way, the infant goes on to invest emotions in images and ideas, and so increasingly meaningful symbols are created. In the toddler stage, this process leads step by step to symbolic communication, and a milestone in the early symbolic communication is the capacity of the child to use the word no. But now what happens? What are the consequences when a child never reached the step of being able to say no in the dialogue with his parents? To comprehend fully what we can conclude from such a parental message, we have to know what it means, the well-known little word no, spoken from a toddler. Here I will quote some important theoretical sentences. René Spitz already in 1965 pointed out that the no contains the capacity to communicate from a distance. It has also to do with the awareness of the fact that the self is separate from the object. Moreover, this signifies to cope with an affective, even an opposite affective distance from the parents. And the no, Freud pointed out, implies the first step of thinking in an autonomous way. It contains a judgment. Also for Spitz, the no represents a first term of abstraction in the sense of adult mental activity. So, logically, symbolized speaking begins with the experienced existence of an addressee, as pointed out by Susan Derry. And in order for true symbolization to occur, there must be some separation, some distance between the person sending a symbol and the addressee. But for the little child to dare such a step of opposition towards the parents, the child must experience some effective preconditions from the side of the parents. The first one concerns the situation of a little toddler who is exercising the first expressions of his own will. Here, the wished-for attitude from a caretaker is to show some easiness and humor to enter into negotiations with the child. That is to say, giving some space to negotiate with the child and setting limits on the other side. Other important preconditions to be given to a child have to do with the concept of mentalization, as Fonagy et al. In 2004 have pointed out. Mentalization is to be understood as a process running parallel to the process of symbolization and development of speech. I already mentioned it when I spoke about symbolization. Now, mentalization describes the process in which a child discovers the world of affects in the relationship with the mother and through the relationship. A mother normally supports the process of generating models in the child, models for coping with affects. That is to say, the mother interprets the feelings and ideas of a child that underlie his behavior. This begins already with a baby, when mother mirrors the baby's feelings. On the one hand, a mother normally mirrors what a baby may feel. On the other hand, it is essential that the mother is mirroring in an exaggerated way, for example with humor and pretending something of the feeling state as non-realistic. This is of special importance when it has to do with negative, aggressive feelings, when the child finds containment for all of his feelings. If mother would react in a congruent, realistic way, the child would become anxious, experiencing this emotion, mother at himself, as dangerous. We will see later in the case presentation why it is so important to reflect on this knowledge when helping dyslexic children. If we go back to the small child who doesn't dare to say no to his parents, we can conclude that such a child has not had sufficient guided support to build up a model to cope with negative feelings. Consequently, he can't tolerate any distance from his primary love object. Further, it is not surprising that such a child at the age of 3 or 4 years has not achieved object constancy, because he has no reliable inner subjective thoughts. He cannot evoke the cognitive emotionally charged presence of the reassuring primary love object in the absence of the parent or during a period when he is frustrated by the parent. In contrast to this, a healthy young child can evoke a pleasurable memory of the object's loving presence for purposes of fantasy, dreaming, problem solving, or for a sense of continuity. He can also tolerate some distance from the parent in time and space and in the emotional state of being alone with unpleasant feelings. We can also assume that the healthy youngster has had the opportunity to experience speech as a transitional, constant, consolatory and comforting mode of functioning. And just in this capacity of being able to use words as a transitional mode, consoling oneself is rooted linguistic competence, as the authors Horton and Sharp pointed out in 1984. And I could observe this in my treatments. Sometimes the children went out saying, we will see, we will see. That was a term I had used before, or something other. Here we discover the bridge from spoken language to the written language. No other than Sigmund Freud wrote in 1930, "Writing is the language of the absent." This is a very remarkable sentence and an occasion to direct our attention to dyslexia. I will give the example of Jimmy, the 11-year-old dyslexic boy. He had written 2 letters in the beginning of the first year of treatment. Jimmy was with his classmates in a school hostel in the country. Like other children, he wrote a letter to his parents. The school teacher had written the address. The parents came to show me this letter and the letter from the next day. The first letter was very difficult to read. There were not only many mistakes, but also a tendency to decompose some letters. But in spite of this difficulty, one could guess that Jimmy asked for more pocket money. But in his next letter, every letter was decomposed. Absolutely nothing was to read. The whole writing was a strange scrawling. How could we understand these writings of Jimmy? Obviously, Jimmy was not able to cope with the distance from his parents and perform a symbolic communication. This fits with his whole developmental history, as you will see. Jimmy had not developed object constancy. This was one of the sources for not being able to cope with the challenge of writing and reading. Object constancy is a developmental capacity that provides the child with a sense of himself and guiding and loving parents, even when there are frustrations or failures. Another point was that he expressed an unpleasant feeling. He reproached his parents for not having sufficient pocket money. As he had never before tried to negotiate with his parents, so he had been very daring in his first letter. And one could guess that in his feeling he lost not only the language of the absent, he lost the whole tie to his parents. His feeling of a broken tie became visible in his absolutely decomposed letters as an expression of total loss of symbolic communication. You already have some information about Jimmy. It is time to present his whole story, starting with his developmental history. The pregnancy of the boy was not wanted. Father even claimed for an abortion. But mother accepted the pregnancy and the child. She suffered some depressive moments and a street phobia during the pregnancy, but the birth of the boy was normal. Yet both parents described Jimmy as a lovely and sunny baby, whom they both loved in a unique fashion, in a way that they had not loved their 2 other children. Jimmy was breastfed for 6 weeks. There were never eating problems. Jimmy was most cuddled by both parents during his first year of life. He crawled early and began to walk at the age of 13 months. Like every infant, Jimmy had falls. But now, mother changed her behavior. And when she told me this story, she also changed her voice. It was quite another woman who spoke. She did not intervene to help him. She was not responding with motor, visual, and vocal signals. She deprived the child from her guiding attention. She felt that he had to learn from his own experiences, as she did not want to overprotect him. So she continued with this policy and often left him to his own resources, or with his 15 months older brother. The consequence was that he became a restless child, and through his clumsy and stormy behavior he had many falls, often hurting himself. He became accident-prone and had scars all over his body. This continued until he entered analysis at the age of 11 years. In this unhappy line of experiences, we can recognize a very important dynamic. It shows once again that we can't look close enough at the early origins of a symptom and how it may acquire significance during the later course of development. If we consider the later disorder of dyslexia, we shall identify it as a result of a chain of unhealthy developmental steps fitting together like a puzzle. Now I like to dwell briefly on the topic of Jimmy's falls, quoting from Andrew Peto. This is a paper from 1970, and I found it very useful. Peto points out that the experiences of falling and losing one's balance in childhood without any support is to be seen as traumatization. It creates a feeling of being abandoned and losing control, and these repeated experiences become incorporated into the early superego. The archaic mother image requires a rejecting and punishing aspect and leads later, whenever the child loses orientation, to the feeling of not being held, being guilty. One can add it contributes to the feeling of being worthless. For Jimmy, this line of traumatization went on. It is not surprising that a child like him, not getting the necessary supporting attention when he tries to walk, will become also insecure when he begins to speak. What is known from the parental side is their failure to respond supportively and patiently to the child's efforts to establish verbal contact with them. Thus, his speech developed slowly when he was about 2 years of age. The parents found his speech difficult to understand for a long time. The mother blamed the child for not being understandable. She often ignored his communication attempts and kept an attitude of an acting mother. She did not further his talking by comforting him with her verbalizations or by encouraging him. She reported that took too much time to make so many words. Also, when she let him do something on his own, she continued to dress him and give him his morning bottle until he was 4 years old. And when he was still a toddler, she often took him on her arms and cuddled him. How much did she talk to him after all? Probably it was not enough. Cleanliness training was not forced by mother. She did not remember when exactly he gained bladder and bowel control, maybe about 3 years of age. Jimmy was always clinging to mother. Mother described Jimmy as her most demanding and restless child, but in spite of this, he remained, from all her children, always the closest to her heart. Father was deeply disappointed with Jimmy. He felt Jimmy was not doing or speaking as well as his older brother did. He praised his first child in the presence of his second son, and admonished Jimmy for not measuring up to the brother's good example. Father preferred openly his older son and withdrew emotionally from Jimmy. Further, when Jimmy, in spite of all the above, tried to talk and to answer his parents, his brother will interrupt him immediately and speak for him. He cut him short. The parents never interfered. When Jimmy was 3 years old, a little sister was born. Jimmy and his brother were sent to kindergarten. In spite of Jimmy's crying and dislike of kindergarten, he was forced to go. This brought him immediately into trouble due to his noisy and destructive behavior and his inability to relate to other children. Yet, Jimmy developed an increasingly close relationship to his older brother. This close relationship endured until early adolescence. It seems to me that it was a kind of transitional relationship. This kind of transitional relationship is described by Martin Wang in his article from 1962 named The Evocation of a Proxy. Wang sees the genesis of this phenomenon in an insufficiency of the mother-child relationship in the symbiotic phase. From the age of 4 until entering school, Jimmy seemed to have had a better time in his life. At the age of 4 years, the family moved to a new house near the maternal grandparents. For 1 year, Jimmy was kept at home and spent most time with his grandparents. He liked to go there. When Jimmy was 5 years old, he was enrolled in another kindergarten where he felt better. He liked his new kindergarten teacher and clung to her. He was said to be less restless during this time. But when entering school, his restlessness and his behavior became worse, which worried his male teacher. Jimmy disliked school in general and writing and reading from the beginning onward. I come now to the reasons and circumstances for the first referral. The outcome of this referral is noteworthy as a typical example of dealing with a dyslexic child in the usual way to do it. Jimmy was first referred to a psychologist and then to a neurologist by the age of 7 years. He was diagnosed as a highly intelligent but dyslexic child. There was the usual hypothesis of basic visual and auditive disturbances connected with problems in the central nervous system. Jimmy's difficulties at school were seen as an expression of his overcharge due to dyslexia. This interpretation served to explain also the evidence of much aggression as well as his destructiveness and anxieties. There were fears of the dark, fears of the unknown, and fears of loss of object and aggressions from the outer world. Jimmy's lack of a positive self-esteem was already visible in a projective test in which Jimmy completed parts of sentences. He said, for example, the child cannot cope with anything. He cannot learn, he is not to be worth much, for a 7-year-old child. The psychologist thought that Jimmy had to be removed from his class to a special class for dyslexic children. But Jimmy continued to dislike school and began to refuse to do his work. Mother controlled him harshly and forced him to write at home. This was a very tormenting situation for both Mother and Jimmy, and led Jimmy to develop a phobic reaction to paper. When he entered analysis, he was unable to touch paper. I will explain now the reasons and circumstances for the second referral to me. At the age of 10 years, Jimmy's behavior at school became completely unmanageable, and the parents were told to seek for therapeutic help. Jimmy's behavior at school oscillated between acting out and depression. He was quite isolated in class and more restless as his classmates. The female school teacher often reported that he had masturbated in class and had to be sent out of the room. She also complained about his excessive need for attention. For example, he would call her name 30 times in one lesson, regardless of the subject or the needs of his classmates. He also tried moral menacing towards his school teacher by saying, "If you squeal on me, I will suffer at home." The first interview with me. I will summarize the most important details of this interview. When I saw Jimmy for the first time, I had the following impression. Jimmy, 11 years old, shuffled along like an old man carrying a heavy burden on his shoulders. His head was inclined. Pessimism was written all over his drooping mouth and hangdog look. Only a second look showed that he was, in fact, a good-looking and well-set-up boy. He gave me his hand, but his stance was one of distance and suspicion. I invited him to sit down in front of me and said to him, "I think you know why we have our meeting here." Jimmy answered, "Oh, yes. I'm so restless. It disturbs my teacher and my parents." I asked him if he could tell me what was worrying him most. He told me that he hadn't got a friend in his class. Also, his class teacher would have changed in relating to him. She is not like she used to be. Another child is her favorite now, but to me, she's still my favorite teacher. Jimmy seemed trying to master his feelings of disappointment and revenge. Moreover, he seemed proud of having achieved renunciation of his suffering and of continuing his admiration from a distance. But at the same time, his restlessness in our session grew. His flood of words seemed to betray his need to control the conversation. His need to remain hyperactive was evidenced by compulsive drumming of fingers and seesawing on the chair. When suddenly lifting his bottom of the chair, he made a grimace and said, "I am feeling my 35th boil." Having reassured himself that I was taking a sympathetic interest, he readily continued, "I have boils all over." I asked when his affliction began. He replied, "I don't know anymore, but I'm quite used to it." "Me? You have had to put up with a lot of pain, both in your body and your mind." Jimmy replied quickly, "So I have, but I can manage. I can put up with anything." This sounded defensive, resigned and masochistic, but also a bit omnipotent. I had the impression that he had given up all positive expectations, and this concerned also his dyslexia. He seemed totally identified with his symptoms. I explained that one had to try to find out what the cause was for all his difficulties with his classmates, the pain with his body and with his dyslexia. I said that this task was precisely what our work together would be about. But Jimmy shook his head. He declared in tones of profound conviction, "Someone like me with a learning disturbance can never earn as much money in his life as someone without it. There's nothing to change. One has to live with it. That's why I think it's not right that some children in my class get so much pocket money." It was clear that he perceived his reading and writing problems as a defect forever. For him, being able to suffer gave him at least a feeling of being strong in the face of misfortune. To feel so was familiar to him. He wanted to know how we would spend our time if he came regularly. He made clear that he couldn't draw, noticing a drawing block and drawing pencils lying around. "I can't touch paper," he said. I summarized that he would be able to put his ideas in words. "Oh, yes, I can talk," he declared, swelling with pride. but he had to reassure himself immediately that I wouldn't tell his parents what he said. And with an intense look in his face, he wondered if I could promise not to tell tales. I come to my introductory remarks. I can't present the analysis of Jimmy in its totality. It was an analysis with 3 sessions weekly for about 3 years, a bit more. The parents were seen at regular but greater intervals. They had therapy on their own, but they actively supported Jimmy's attendance of treatment. Later on, they were to continue their positive attitude to analysis. I will mention only the most important stages and points of the therapeutic process with Jimmy. The forging of a treatment alliance was a long and painstaking process. The patient brought all the signs of his inhibited and traumatized development, his unsolved and repressed conflicts, his essential distress, and his pivotal neurotic conflicts into the transference relationship. This was precisely the chance to help him. For me, it was sometimes a difficult task to set limits while creating some structure, support, and protection within the therapeutic situation, as well as providing him with sufficient space and freedom to unfold in the therapeutic process. The treatment made the weakness in Jimmy's object relationships abundantly clear. Jimmy had had some experiences of discipline at home, who provided him with some security and safety. As I pointed out, he was a child that had not been helped in coping with negative feelings. Only the parental strictness helped him to repress his aggressions and his feelings wanting to destroy everything. But feelings that have been repressed are not really mastered. They are still there. So, as soon as he found himself in an environment that did not provide that kind of structure he was used to, he became very provocative everywhere. Moreover, from the beginning onwards, when he was sent to school, the male authority was denigrated and Jimmy showed his oppositional tendencies. This was precisely what he never dared to show toward his own father, whom he made into an admired object. Nevertheless, he found an outlet for his repressed feelings by transferring them to paternal figures in the outer world. This was less dangerous for him, and it is important to underline that his outlet could very easily be extended to the handling of the written language. Why is this so? I think there might be a cultural aspect to it. This aspect is unconsciously playing a role in nearly every case of dyslexia. When we look at our cultural history, we recognize that the written language has always to do with authorities in the past. Originally, the written word had to do with the relationship between mankind and divinities. This is so in Christianity and in other religions as well, as we can assume that this relationship is deeply laid down in our unconscious, and therefore the written language lends itself to being involved in the authority conflicts of dyslexic children. Another aspect facilitating this displacement comes from the outer world. Here I can only speak for Germany, where this happens with the so-called dyslexia, and that it's the absolute ignorance of any psychological conflicts being involved. Another factor may be, at least in the last decades, that the individual reasons for dyslexia match the spirit of the time. Insofar as the value of orthography as belonging to the upper class was reduced, this actually has changed for the better. But nonetheless, there's always an interplay between the individual and the culture. This is a wide field, But let us come back to Jimmy. How does Jimmy behave in the therapeutic situation with me? At the beginning, Jimmy found the sessions boring and hopeless, stupid. That is only for you to earn money, he said. I replied, I think you can't imagine that you are worth for the expenses your parents make for you. He behaved as if I had said nothing. With other provocations, he put my patience to the test. For example, he turned the heating full up on leaving and said, so everyone else who comes here will boil. So hostility against other children in treatment with me became evident. I took it up later. First I pointed to the real work in an analytic hour, that is, thinking about things and talking about difficulties, adding, if we just sat here boiling and getting excited, it would be difficult to conduct a useful conversation. It was clear that my introduction of setting limits only temporarily could abate his excitement. But at least this gave him a little sense of safety when he realized that my setting limits did not involve either punishment or aggressive retaliation. Often he entered the sessions in an emotional state that evoked feelings of a catastrophe. He was full of complaints about his mortal enemies. He told me his life's philosophy. If I don't like something, I start a fight. Then I get beaten up. That's how I manage all. I commented, this sounds very sad. That's how it is. I don't care. So I cope with all, he declared. Then, sometime later, his defensive, provocative attitude reached for the first time his peak. He began menacing me. I've really got better things to do than come to these bloody silly sessions. I could provoke you so much you would run after me to slap me. He took a fat newspaper and began to cut up the paper into little pieces. If you count these pieces of newspaper, you will know into how many pieces I'd like to tear you up. While continuing to cut the paper, he looked at me watchful and anxiously. What would happen now? I answered first by referring to his aggressive affect. Oh, I see how great your anger must be in so many pieces. Then I added with a bit humor, I'll have really much to do when you leave, and I have to count all these pieces. My intention was to make his affect more digestible. And Jimmy's rage and anxiety seemed markedly reduced. After a moment of silence between us, I showed him that I was still thinking about the message he had given me. I said I thought it said that he could never imagine anything working out good, or our relationship being nothing but battles. I continued, perhaps you've seen so many things go to pieces. You are expecting the same to happen here. The experience of being understood helped Jimmy to reveal his sadness at this moment. Yet, yes, in pieces, everything goes to pieces, he complained. He went on to tell me how sad it was that his class would come to an end with the summer holidays, and that his favorite teacher would leave the school and the town because she was getting married. This real loss stirred up deeper levels of anxiety over object loss and fears of repetition in therapy, all the more since he had begun to find a little security and protection within the treatment situation. For several following sessions, the cutting of paper became a ritual of pleasure for Jimmy. He seemed to enjoy that I left him room to move and act and the fact that I didn't take a dreaded revenge. He showed flashes of humor too. Often he asked whether I had counted the bits of paper. To show him that I understood what he felt, I said, "You'd like that, wouldn't you? You keeping me busy counting." And we both began to smile. "When you accept everything I say," he said in a playful manner, "then say that the sessions won't cost anything." He commented our sessions at this time as being boring, but very nice. And he added, "I can imagine that I could carry on with you for 1 year, but no more." At this time, he tidied the room after sessions, sweeping up the bits of newspaper, and he commented, "I'm not a good housewife, but so I don't get on your nerves." I replied, "It's nice to see how friendly you can be." Along the lines of our growing treatment alliance, Jimmy continued one of his next sessions by rocking his chair. He rocked to and fro until it fell over backwards, the couch fortunately breaking his fall. I commented that he seemed to demonstrate his need for someone to look after him. "That's nothing," he replied. "I'm always doing this in school. I'm always sitting on the back of my chair. One morning I fell off 12 times. "Your poor old body," I said with empathy. Jimmy seemed to enjoy my sympathy for his body. Sitting on the floor, he touched scratches and bruises all over his body. "My mother is always scolding me about this," Jimmy remarked. "But most of my wounds are inflicted in battles with my mortal enemies," he added. Thereafter, the scratches and bruises lessened. At the end of the first treatment year, Mother reported that Jimmy had far fewer falls and that he seemed to treat his body quite differently. However, within the first year, alongside the development of a positive relationship, Jimmy showed how disappointed he was that I was not an omnipotent object. I had not prevented the breakdown of his table lamp at home. So he burst into the room, gesticulating wildly, and looked at me questioningly. "You sit here, not a word, not understanding a thing. Don't you know what's happened?" He screwed pieces of newspaper into a ball and threw them against the wall. Slowly he managed to tell me that the lamp on his writing table in his room was broken. His distress was like that of a small child whose mother had given him no comfort and no reassurance after some mischief. By acknowledging his disappointment, sympathizing with how alone he must have felt in that unfortunate mischief, I was able to win back Jimmy for the feeling that he was understood after all, on the affective level to which he had regressed. This kind of interventions, verbalizing his feelings, he may have had in many occasions, the feelings he had give him in many occasions to follow throughout the whole treatment process, and this helped him towards a new integration of all kinds of affects. This contributed as well to stabilize his feelings for outer realities being outside from himself. For a long time he remained also insecure in his discrimination between fantasy and reality. And Jimmy showed that he was caught in a dilemma. It concerned the relationship between his feelings and his thinking and vice versa. Thinking made him anxious because of allowing associated sexual stimuli with the approaching puberty. And when he was aware of his feelings, He was threatened by possibly connected ideas and fantasies. So he lived always in the alarming expectation that something he felt or thought will take shape and he would be punished. There were many interpretations from me. Only continuing reality testing reassured him that he could express his ideas and feelings without fearing their materialization. It became apparent how feelings made it impossible for him to concentrate on cognitive statements of contents. This threw light upon his situation at school. He became anxious because he felt as if he would be manipulated when he had biology instruction about hormones. In reality, he felt overwhelmed by his own sexual stimuli. This had to be worked through for a long period. I will come to this point in the next lecture. But the defensive refusal against being instructed at school was generalized. And there were other roots as well. Jimmy was on the whole line impaired in imagining that it could be fruitful for him to cooperate with someone else for the reciprocal pleasure and interest. So he could only think from school only teachers can profit, because they earn money and can feel successful. This attitude had many reasons. Jimmy had, as we know, traumatizing experiences during his speech development. Moreover, on the whole, he lacked the experience of being an agent in anything positive he had done. The parents seemed to have never mirrored him doing something well, and he was at least not sufficiently well thought of by his parents as a thinking child. He had not internalized such a representation by his parents, like Fonagy in 1998 put it, "Mother thinks me as a thinking child, I am existing as a thinking child." And when Jimmy tried doing anything creative on his own, he showed a marked lack of skill. At first, this became manifest when he asked for pottery clay with a set of instruments. When he used it for the first time, one of the phallic instruments, he held it as if it would be taboo for him. And by his following clumsy handling of the instrument, it broke through. I observed in his reaction for a very short moment despair, that then turned out in intended destructiveness. He broke the whole set and threw it in the needed mess of clay. He called it now his experimental pot. He mixed it up with dead leaves and broken pencils. But I had to give attention and control to his pot when the time of vacation came. This was to hold the tie between us. But I also saw some hope for help and solution in the future in this name Jimmy gave to his pot, namely an experimental pot. Only later in treatment I understood how in this breaking of a phallic instrument an early traumatic experience with all feelings involved broke through. This was understood and confirmed by the memories of Jimmy. But until we come to this point, Jimmy will demonstrate how his early traumatizing experiences color all his phases of his development and what such experiences have to do with dyslexia. This will be our topic for the next lecture.